There are shows that leave you with a hangover. And then there are shows that leave you with this bruise. Like you didn't even realize you were clenching your jaw for 8 hours until the credits roll. And suddenly you're sitting there, blinking at your own living room, wondering why you feel personally rejected by a fictional Dragon King. Deny me, Dragon King is that kind of drama. It doesn't just do romance. It does romance like a wound that keeps reopening at the worst possible times, and then it has the audacity to ask you to root for healing while it keeps tossing salt over its shoulder like seasoning. I'm talking about the 2026 fantasy melodrama, where human Lyra stumbles into the orbit of Kale. The Dragon King shares one of those nights that feels like fate signing your name in hot ink. And then he gets played by a fake prophecy and throws her out like she was a mistake he can scrub off his conscience. And of course, she doesn't just walk away with heartbreak. She walks away carrying their half-dragon daughter, Umber. Years later she returns because Umber is sick and she needs a healer, and the old spark doesn't politely wait in the corner. It comes back like it owns the room. Meanwhile, jealous rivals start sharpening their smiles, and all these hidden blood ties start shifting the floor under everybody's feet. It's family, betrayal, legacy, and that very specific kind of love that makes you feel brave and humiliated at the same time. This is Flick Flair, and I've been dying to finally sit down and talk this one out like we're debriefing after a group project where one guy kept deleting the slideshow. If you enjoy these long, feelings-first breakdowns, consider subscribing to Flick Flair. And just so we are on the same page about spoilers, I'm going moderate here. I'm going to talk freely about the setup, the emotional turns, and the kind of story engines it's running on. But I'm not going to spell out latent reveals in a way that ruins the fun of discovering them. Because the thing about Deny Me, Dragon King, is it's not even the plot that gets you first. It's the vibe of inevitability. The show feels like it's constantly whispering, you can't outrun what you did. Even the way it frames Kale's kingdom, the scale of it, the cold gleam of those halls, it's not just fantasy set dressing. It's a guilt machine. Every corridor looks like it's been polished by generations of people pretending they're fine. And Lyra entering that space again years later isn't just a woman returning to a man. It's a human body walking back into a system that once spat her out. What hooked me, weirdly, wasn't the passionate night premise. I've seen a million versions of mysterious powerful man, fated encounter, oops emotions. What hooked me was the cruelty of the misunderstanding and how specifically humiliating it is. Being rejected because you did something wrong is one thing. Being rejected because someone else lied, and the person you trusted didn't even pause to check your face before sentencing you, that hits different. That's the kind of betrayal your brain replays at 3 a.m. while you're brushing your teeth. Like, actually, I should have said this. The drama understands that kind of pain, and it milks it, but not lazily. It keeps asking, what does that do to your posture, your voice, the way you ask for help later? And I know. A Dragon King being tricked by a fake prophecy sounds like something you'd summarize in a group chat with a crying laughing emoji, and then never watch. But here's the surprising part. The prophecy isn't treated like a cheap misunderstanding trope. It's treated like a weapon that works because Kale already has the weakness it needs. He's built to rule, built to distrust, built to choose the safety of tradition over the mess of his own feelings. The lie lands because he's trained his whole life to treat emotion as a threat. So when he casts Lyra out, it's not just man makes bad choice. It's system makes predictable choice through a man's hand. That's why it stings. Let's talk about Kale for a second, because this show dares you to love him. And I did, against my better judgment. But I didn't love him in a he's perfect way. I loved him the way you love a character who makes you whisper at the screen, oh, you're going to regret that so hard. Kale is written with this tension between presence and panic. He carries himself like a statue until he doesn't. And when the cracks show, the show doesn't dress them up. It lets him be ugly in his fear. The best moments for him aren't the big dominant lines. It's the little micro pauses where you can tell he's choosing the wrong thing because it's easier than admitting he wants the right thing. And lyra. Lyra is where the whole drama earns its teeth. A lot of fantasy romances will give you a strong female lead on paper and then still have her act like a leaf in the male lead's storm. Lyra is not that. She's soft in a way that feels earned, not decorative. She has this survival intelligence that shows up in how she speaks, how she navigates rooms, how she saves her anger for when it matters. When she returns years later, it isn't a triumphant strut. It's a controlled re-entry. It's someone who knows exactly what a kingdom can do to a human woman who doesn't belong there, and she still walks in anyway because her child is sick. That's not romance. That's courage. And if you're thinking, okay, so it's a mom story too. Yes. And I mean that as the highest compliment. Because Amber isn't just a plot coupon. She's not just a cute Huff-Dragon kid designed to generate merch and tearful close-ups. The show treats her illness like a real atmospheric weight. You feel it in the pacing. Scenes don't just move from beat to beat. They drag a little, like the characters are carrying tiredness in their bones. When Lyra is looking for a healer, the desperation isn't theatrical. It's practical. It's the kind of desperation where you're not even proud enough to cry. You're just counting minutes and swallowing panic. And that's where the story gets messy in the best way. Because this return isn't framed as destiny brings lovers back together. It's framed as a mother runs out of options. The romance reignites, sure, but it reignites under pressure. And pressure makes people reveal themselves. If you want a drama where love is gentle and easy and healing is linear, this is not that. Deny me. Dragon King believes healing is humiliating. It believes reconciliation is a negotiation with your own shame. Now, I'm going to relive one moment for you. No super specific late spoilers. Just the kind of scene this show does so well. Because it's the moment I knew I was in trouble emotionally. Lyra is back in proximity to Kale, and the air between them has that old heat. But it's buried under years of unspoken damage. They're in one of those cavernous royal spaces where sound doesn't disappear, it echoes. Every footstep feels like an announcement. Kale's presence is all edges, like he's trying to be more king than man. And Lyra is holding herself together with pure willpower. Then Amber's condition comes up, and for a second, you see Lyra's mask slip. It's not a sob. It's not a big breakdown. It's the smallest tremor in her voice, the tiniest falter in her breathing, the kind you only notice if you've ever tried to keep it together in public because you can't afford to fall apart. The camera lingers just long enough to make you uncomfortable. Not in a voy way, in a this is real way. And Kale's face, this is where the acting, the direction, all of it locks in, doesn't go soft immediately. He doesn't get to be the instant regretful hero. First there's confusion, then shock, then this flash of something like calculation, like he's trying to solve a problem in his head instead of letting himself feel the fact that the problem is a child. His child. That delay is the point. That delay is the tragedy. And when the emotion finally lands, it lands like a punch you hear more than you see. If you're waiting for me to say, Kale is trash, I'm not going to give you the easy version. Because the show doesn't give you the easy version. It wants you to hold to truths at once. He wronged her in a way that could have destroyed her life. And he is capable of loving in a way that could rebuild it. The tension is whether he deserves the chance. And the drama is very aware that deserves is a loaded word when there's a child involved. Also, can we talk about how fantasy dramas always act like a palace is the perfect place to raise a secret child? Like yes, let's hide a Huff-Dragon kid in the one location where everybody is nosy, magical, politically motivated, and allergic to privacy. It's giving I brought my emotional support scandal to the most public building in the country. But the show actually uses that absurdity well because the palace environment turns every interaction into a chess move. A glance is a threat. A compliment is a test. A request is leverage. The jealous rivals plotting, that element could have been soap in a cheap way. and sometimes it flirts with that. There are moments where you can feel the story enjoying its own mess a little too much, like it's twirling the ends of its mustache and going, wouldn't it be delicious if someone overheard this at the worst time? And yes, I rolled my eyes once or twice. But the reason it still works is because those rivals aren't just there to stir drama. They're there to embody the kingdom's appetite. The court isn't just a backdrop. It's a living organism that feeds on weakness. Lyra's return is blood in the water. And had a contrarian take, one that surprised me while I was watching. The fake prophecy isn't the real villain of the story. I know, it's the inciting betrayal, it's the thing that detonates everything. But the real villain is Kale's willingness to outsource his moral decisions to an external truth. If it wasn't a prophecy, it would have been tradition. If it wasn't tradition, it would have been his advisors. If it wasn't his advisors, it would have been fear dressed up as duty. The show is basically saying, be careful what you call fate. Sometimes it's just an excuse with better PR. That's why when Lyra comes back, the power dynamic is so fascinating. In the past, she was the outsider who got swept up and then discarded. In the present, she's still an outsider, but she's an outsider with leverage. Not political leverage, not magical leverage necessarily, maternal leverage, emotional leverage, the kind that doesn't care about thrones. She's not asking to be chosen. She's asking for a healer. That difference matters. It flips the whole romance from please love me to prove you're safe. And I want to linger on Umber for a second more, because the Huff Dragon element could have been played as a gimmick. Instead it becomes this quiet metaphor for inheritance. Umber is literally the fusion of two worlds that don't naturally trust each other. Her body is the proof of love and the evidence of scandal. Her sickness, too, isn't just physical. It reads like the consequence of a love that was severed wrong. Like the universe itself is saying, you can't cut this bond and expect the child to be fine. That's heavy, and the show doesn't always say it out loud, but you can feel it humming underneath. There's also something smart in how the drama frames time. Years later isn't just a line. The show lets you feel the sediment of those years. Lyra isn't frozen in the moment she was cast out. She's lived. She's learned how to swallow certain hopes. She's learned which doors open when you knock politely, and which doors only open when you threaten to break them. And Kale, meanwhile, carries the kind of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people but never met. He has a court, he has power, he has ritual, and yet the show makes him feel emotionally underfed. That's not an excuse. It's context. And context is what makes drama hit harder than trope. If you've ever been the person who had to show up somewhere you were once humiliated, school reunion, old job, family event, whatever, then you know exactly why Lyra's return scenes can feel almost too intimate. There's a particular kind of bravery in walking back into a place that remembers you as that girl, especially when you've grown into someone who knows you deserved better. The show keeps putting her in spaces where she has to stand tall while people look at her like a rumor, and it's maddening. I found myself getting protective. Like, irrationally protective. Like, I was ready to fight fictional nobles in the comments section of my own brain. And the direction really leans into that. The blocking often positions Lyra slightly lower, slightly off-center, slightly outside the most comfortable space in the room. It's subtle, but it's constant. She's always having to adjust, to accommodate, to make herself smaller so the room can stay big. Then, when she has a moment of defiance, the camera finally gives her the center. It's not flashy empowerment cinematography. It's quiet reclamation. The show is good at that kind of visual grammar. Okay, but let's not pretend it's perfect, because I did have issues. There are times when the pacing gets addicted to its own tension. Like it doesn't trust a calm scene to hold your attention unless someone is withholding information or someone is lurking with an agenda. And I'm like, guys, you have actors who can carry silence. Let them. Not every scene needs a dagger hidden in a compliment. Sometimes the most devastating thing is to people being honest for 30 seconds and not knowing what to do with it. Still, when it lands, it really lands. Especially in those intimate scenes where Kale and Lyra are forced into proximity. And the chemistry isn't just heat, it's history. It's resentment braided with longing. The show understands that the sexiest thing in a second-chance romance isn't the body. It's the memory. It's the way someone's presence can unlock a version of you that you thought you buried. And the music, let me give the music its flowers, because it's doing emotional carpentry. There's a recurring motif that shows up when Lyra's resolve is being tested. And it's not this big swelling orchestral feel now command. It's more like a pulse, like a heartbeat under the floorboards. And in the palace scenes, the sound design emphasizes emptiness. You hear fabric. You hear heels. You hear distance. It makes the kingdom feel less like a home and more like a museum of power, which is perfect for a story about a man who rules a place that doesn't know how to love. And speaking of love, the title Deny Me, Dragon King is so petty, in the best way. It reads like a dare. Like Lyra is staring straight at him and saying, go on. Deny it again. Deny what you did. Deny what you feel. Deny your child. Deny me. See what it costs you. The show is obsessed with denial as a survival strategy. Kale denies emotion to stay king. Lyra denies longing to stay sane. The court denies humanity to stay in control. And Amber's existence is a denial that refuses to hold. She is the truth that keeps breathing. There's a moment early in the return arc where you can feel the show asking a dangerous question. What does Kale actually want? Not what he's supposed to want, not what makes him look strong, not what his bloodline demands. What does he want when nobody is watching? And every time the drama hints at the answer, it yanks it away. Not because it's playing games, but because that's what Kale does to himself. The story structure mirrors his emotional cowardice, which is infuriating and also kind of brilliant. Another thing I appreciated is that Lyra isn't written as someone who returns purely to punish him. She has anger, absolutely, and she should. But she's not petty for the sake of it. Her focus is Amber. That's what keeps her grounded and keeps the show from turning into a revenge fantasy. And when Lyra does snap, when she finally lets a piece of her rage show, it's not stylized. It's messy. It's the kind of anger that comes from being forced to be polite for too long. Now, I want to talk about the way the show handles hidden blood ties, because that phrase can mean a lot of things in this genre, and I'm not going to pretend I know every twist you might be thinking of. What I can talk about is the vibe. The show uses blood as both literal lineage and metaphorical obligation. Who you're related to in this world isn't just trivia. It's your sentence. It's who gets to own your future. And that's why Lyra's presence is such a threat. She represents a connection that wasn't sanctioned by the system. She represents love that wasn't approved. And the system hates what it can't catalog. It also makes every tender moment feel stolen, like it's happening in enemy territory. Even when Kale is being gentle, when he's trying, when he's offering resources, when he's softening around Amber, you're still aware that there are eyes everywhere, and those eyes are hungry. That constant surveillance adds tension to scenes that could have been simple. A hand reaching out becomes political. A smile becomes evidence. And I'm telling you, as someone who loves melodrama when it's done with intention, this show understands the assignment. Let me be honest about something personal, because I didn't expect this drama to get under my skin the way it did. There's a specific kind of storyline that hits me every time. Someone being misjudged, not loudly, not dramatically, but casually. Like their pain doesn't even deserve a real investigation. And watching Lyra get cast out because of a fake prophecy activated something in me that I thought I'd outgrown. It reminded me of being younger and having someone decide who you are based on a rumor. And no matter how you explain, they've already chosen the version of you they can live with. That's what Kale does. And seeing Lyra rebuild a life anyway, seeing her walk back in without begging, that actually made my throat tighten. Not in a performative way. In a, wow, okay, I'm apparently not as over certain things as I thought way. And this is where I want to give credit to the performances, because this kind of story only works if the actors can sell contradiction. Kale has to be both magnetic and infuriating. Lyra has to be both vulnerable and unbreakable without turning into a cardboard strong woman. Umber has to feel like a person, not a device. And the show's success, for me, is that I believed the emotional physics. When Kale hesitates, it isn't because the script needs a pause. It's because the character is terrified of the cost of choosing. You know what else I liked? The show's restraint with the fantasy elements. It could have gone full fireworks every episode to remind you, hey, dragons exist. Instead, it uses the dragoness like seasoning, not the whole meal. The fantasy is there to heighten the stakes, to make inheritance and power literal. But the emotional conflict is painfully human. The most dangerous thing in the story isn't magic. It's pride. It's fear. It's the instinct to protect your ego at the expense of someone else's life. And I'm not saying there aren't indulgent moments. There are. Sometimes the drama leans into that lush, slow motion. Look at the king being dramatically tortured by longing aesthetic. And I ate it up, unfortunately. I am not immune. But I also laughed at myself because I could feel the show pressing the exact buttons it designed. Like, yes, okay, we get it. He's tall and sad and morally compromised. Congratulations, you have invented catnip. But when the show pivots to Lyra's point of view, it becomes something else. It becomes less about seduction and more about endurance. Lyra isn't fantasizing about being chosen. She's calculating survival. And that keeps the romance from floating away into fluff. Every time Kale reaches toward her, the question isn't, will they kiss? The question is, what would it cost her to trust him again? That's the real tension. There's a particular flavor of scene deny me. Dragon King does better than most. The almost apology. Not the full apology. The almost. The kind where someone is standing on the edge of accountability and you can see them wanting to jump, but they're afraid of what's in the water. Kale has several of these moments. And what's deliciously frustrating is the show doesn't let him get credit for almost doing the right thing. It shows you the damage of delay. It shows you what it feels like to be Lyra, hearing the shape of remorse without the substance of it. And that brings me to the most quietly brutal part of the premise. Lyra has to ask for help from the person who broke her. That dynamic is inherently loaded. Even if Kale is willing, even if he's trying, the act of asking reopens the wound. It puts her back in a position of vulnerability in front of someone who proved he could be cruel. It's the kind of situation where your dignity and your child's health are in the same room and you have to choose. The show never lets you forget that this isn't romantic destiny. It's triage. So when the old sparks reignite, they don't feel like a reward. They feel like a complication. And I love that. I love a romance that doesn't pretend attraction is moral. Lyra can still want him and still hate him. Kale can still crave her and still be unworthy. The show doesn't rush to tidy that up. And just when you think it's going to settle into a pattern, Lyra seeks healer, Kale broods, rival scheme, repeat. The drama starts threading in those hidden blood ties in a way that changes the temperature. Not because of some cheap gotcha, but because it reframes why certain people are so invested in Lyra's presence, why certain smiles feel too sharp, why certain threats are delivered like they're doing you a favor. It's one of those narrative moves where you can feel the story widening its shoulders. Like, oh, you thought this was only about two lovers? No. This is about the architecture of a dynasty. And I want to pause on the word architecture, because the show is visually obsessed with structures. Towers, gates, staircases, thresholds. People are always framed in doorways, always separated by railings or pillars. It's not subtle symbolism, but it's effective. These characters are constantly confronting barriers. Some are physical, most are internal. The palace itself becomes a metaphor for Kale's emotional fortress. Lyra entering it isn't just travel, it's infiltration. One of my favorite choices is how the show uses distance in dialogue scenes. Sometimes Kale and Lyra will be talking about something deeply personal, and they'll be standing absurdly far apart in a room big enough to host a banquet. And it's not just for aesthetic, it's emotional truth. They can't get close without risking collapse. So they perform separation with their bodies even when their eyes are locked. It's the kind of staging that makes you feel the longing in your ribs. And yes, I'm going to talk about chemistry. Because if you're watching this drama, you're watching for chemistry. It's not just they look good together. It's that their energy shifts the air. When they share a scene, the pacing changes. The editing lingers. The background noise fades. The show knows what it has. But what makes it work is that the chemistry isn't always sweet. Sometimes it's hostile. Sometimes it's bitter. Sometimes it's the kind where you can tell they know each other's weaknesses and they're tempted to use them. That's real intimacy, honestly. Knowing how to hurt someone is a form of closeness. The question is whether you choose to. I will say, the drama occasionally flirts with making Lyra too saintly. There are moments where I wanted her to be just a little uglier, just a little more selfish. Because trauma doesn't always produce perfect motherhood and poetic forgiveness. And to be fair, the show does give her edges, but it sometimes smooths them out quickly. That's probably my biggest critique so far. It's so invested in Lyra being admirable that it risks sanding down the mess that would make her feel even more human. But then it does something small and perfect, like letting her hesitate before stepping into a room where she knows she'll be judged. Letting her take a breath and brace. Letting her adjust her expression like she's putting on armor. Those tiny beats are what save the character from becoming an icon instead of a person. And Kale, for all my affection, is a problem. A beautiful problem, but a problem. Because the show wants to sell you on his capacity for change, and I'm always watching for whether it's earned or just aesthetically pleasing. Regret can be very sexy in fiction. It can also be cheap. The drama is walking that line. When Kale's remorse shows up as action, resources, protection, actual listening, it hits. When it shows up as brooding and tortured stares into the middle distance, I'm like, okay, Hamlet, maybe do something useful? Still, the show is very aware of that critique. It keeps putting Kale in situations where brooding isn't enough. A child is sick. Politics are moving. Rivals are circling. He has to choose. And every time he chooses wrong, you feel the cost. That's why I'm invested. The drama doesn't let him fail without consequence. It doesn't let him be misunderstood as a permanent excuse. And the rivals, the schemers, the ones who smell weakness in the air, they're not just there to give us someone to boo. They're there to pressure test Kale's growth. If he's going to reclaim Lyra's trust, he has to protect her from the very world he rules. And that's such a juicy thematic knot. Can you love someone while still benefiting from the system that hurts them? Can you be a good man while being the king of a machine built on cruelty? The show doesn't answer quickly, and that's why it stays interesting. I also need to mention how Deny Me, Dragon King handles touch. It's not constant. It's not gratuitous. When hands meet, it's a moment. And the camera treats it like a decision. A palm hovering before contact. Fingers curling like they're afraid. The show understands that for people with history, touch isn't just affection. It's a question. Are we allowed to do this? Will it break us? Will it lie to us? There's a scene where I keep thinking about where Lyra is trying to stay focused on Amber's health. And Kale keeps orbiting that focus like he's pulled by gravity he doesn't understand. He wants to be near, but he doesn't know how to be near without taking. And that, to me, is the heart of his arc. Learning to love without claiming. Learning to offer without controlling. Learning to apologize without making the apology about his own pain. And the show teases that learning in maddening increments. Just when you see a glimpse of him getting it, the court drags him back into performance. The king mask snaps on. The voice goes colder. The posture stiffens. And Lyra notices. Lyra always notices. That's another thing I love. She's not written as someone who gets dazzled by status. She reads him. She knows when he's hiding. She knows when he's scared. She knows when he's choosing safety over honesty. And let's be real, watching Kale get read by a human woman who has nothing to lose but everything to protect is deeply satisfying. There is scene energy where you can tell he's used to being obeyed, and Lyra is like, I'm not one of your subjects. Not in a bratty way, in a factual way, in a your authority doesn't reach into my soul way. Those moments are the show at its strongest because they're not about power fantasy. They're about boundaries. The show also has this recurring tension around what Amber represents to different people. To Lyra, she's her child, her heart outside her body. To Kale, she's love and guilt and legacy colliding at once. To the court, she's either a threat or an asset depending on who's looking. And that's where the hidden blood ties piece becomes a ticking clock. Because in a dynasty story, blood is never private. It's currency. It's justification. It's war. And every time the drama cuts from an intimate mother-daughter moment to a wide cold palace shot, it's like it's reminding you, tenderness is not safe here. Tenderness is the first thing people exploit. One more confession, because I feel like I have to be honest if I'm going to ask you to trust my taste. There were points watching this where I actually got mad at Lyra for being near Kale again. Not because she's wrong, because it scared me. It scared me in that protective, irrational way, like watching a friend go back to someone who hurt them. And then I had to check myself, because that reaction is exactly what the drama is poking at. It's easy to say, never go back. It's harder when there's a child involved, when survival is on the line, when the person who hurt you is also the person with the power to save someone you love. The show forces you to sit in that discomfort. It doesn't let you pretend love is a clean decision. And that's why, even when the writing wobbles, even when the pacing occasionally overcranks the tension, I kept coming back. Because the emotional questions are real. They're just dressed in crowns and prophecy and dragon blood. There's also something delicious about the way the show handles old sparks. It doesn't make them cute. It makes them inconvenient. A look that lasts too long. A conversation that turns too personal too fast. A memory that slips into the present like a knife. And because we are in moderate spoilers territory, I'll keep this general. But there are sequences where you can feel the story deliberately putting them in situations where their bodies remember before their minds agree. The camera will catch Lyra's reaction a half second after Kale speaks in a certain tone, like her nervous system is responding to a version of him she tries not to miss. And Kale's eyes will track her like he's starving, but trying to act full. That's the kind of romantic tension I live for, the kind that hurts a little. But then Amber's illness snaps everything back into place, and the show refuses to let romance become the priority. Which is brave, honestly, because a lot of dramas would use the sick child as a constant tearjerker while still making the couple the main event. Here, Amber feels like the axis. Everyone else is orbiting. And that makes the story feel less like a fantasy and more like a family crisis inside a fantasy. The question the drama keeps raising, quietly, is, can Kale become the kind of man who deserves to be in Amber's life without treating Lyra like a doorway to the child? Can he respect Lyra as a person, not just as the mother of his heir? Can he love without entitlement? And can Lyra accept help without surrendering her autonomy? Those are not easy questions. And the show doesn't always answer them cleanly, but it keeps them alive. And just when you think you've settled into rooting for the obvious outcome, the drama does that thing it does best. It reminds you that love isn't the only force in the room. Pride is there. Fear is there. Politics are there. Other people want things. Other people have stories. Other people have claims. And the more Lyra and Amber become visible inside Kale's world, the more that world starts reacting like an immune system, rejecting a foreign truth. Which brings me to a moment I can't stop thinking about. The atmosphere when Lyra is moving through court spaces with Amber's needs hanging over her. The show loves to shoot her in these long, elegant takes where she's walking forward, and the background is moving around her like a current. People glance. People whisper. People step aside too late on purpose. And Lyra doesn't flinch. She doesn't perform fear. She doesn't perform confidence either. She performs forward motion. And it's so compelling because that's what motherhood can look like. Not speeches. Not hero poses. Just forward motion when you're exhausted. And Kale watching that forward motion is where the regret becomes tangible. Not because he's sad, because he's realizing she did all of that without him. She suffered without him. She built a life without him. Umber existed without him. And now he's looking at the consequences of his denial like they're walking through his palace in plain sight. And the show is very careful to make that realization hurt, but not in a way that makes him the victim. It's the difference between poor Kale and Kale. Look at what you did. That's a tightrope. And so far, I think the drama mostly stays on it. The more we get into the return arc, the more you can feel the show shifting from romantic tragedy into something more like reclamation. Not in a simplistic empowerment sense. In a reclaiming narrative sense. Lyra isn't just returning for a healer. She's returning to a story that was told about her without her consent. She's returning to a place that decided she was disposable. And now she's forcing it to see her as real. That's powerful. And there's a specific tension in the way Kale responds to that. Sometimes he tries to control the situation because control is his native language. Sometimes he tries to soften because he's learning. Sometimes he fails in ways that make you want to shake him. And sometimes, when he's quiet, when he listens, when he lets Lyra speak without interrupting or correcting, you feel the possibility of something better. But the drama isn't just about whether they get back together. It's about whether a kingdom that thrives on hierarchy can tolerate a love that doesn't fit its rules. And if it can't, what do they do? Who do they become? Who do they sacrifice? And that's where I want to go next, because the show starts doing something really sneaky with the idea of family. It's not just blood. It's chosen. It's weaponized. It's bargained with. It's promised and withheld. And when hidden blood ties begin to surface, the story starts asking who gets to define a family in the first place. Is it the king? The court? The prophecy? Or the mother standing at a sick child's bedside, refusing to let anyone rewrite the truth? Because once you start tugging on that thread, the whole tapestry starts to strain, and the characters who look like side players suddenly feel like they've been holding knives behind their backs the whole time. And you begin to realize that Lyra returning didn't just reignite a romance, it destabilized an entire ecosystem of secrets. And that's when the show starts feeling less like romance with fantasy garnish, and more like a pressure cooker where every character is sweating for different reasons. Because the court isn't just jealous rivals in pretty outfits. The court is a belief system. It's a room full of people who have spent their whole lives learning how to survive by predicting the king's mood, how to turn loyalty into a performance, how to smile while calculating. So when Lyra walks back in with Umber, she's not just bringing in a personal history. She's bringing in a kind of moral chaos the court doesn't know how to file away. She's a mother. She's human. She's connected to Kale in a way that bypasses ceremony. And nothing terrifies a hierarchy like something it can't control with etiquette. And the jealous rivals, the ones plotting and posturing, they're doing what courts always do in these stories. They're trying to turn emotion into opportunity. A romance isn't romance to them. It's leverage. It's succession. It's the future of the throne. It's whether the king can be manipulated through his heart. And the show does this really satisfying thing where it treats those rivals as intelligent, not cartoonish. You may hate them, but you understand the logic. In their world, if you don't scheme, you get schemed on. What I loved is how Deny Me, Dragon King keeps returning to the idea that everyone thinks they're protecting something. Kale thinks he's protecting the kingdom, his lineage, the stability of rule. And sometimes he hides behind those words like they're armor. Lyra thinks she's protecting Umber. And she is, but she's also protecting her own sanity from being colonized by Kale's regret. The rivals think they're protecting their claim, their family, their place at the table. Even the people who are clearly doing harm are often doing it with this self-justifying calm that makes it creepier. Nobody wakes up and says, "Time to be evil." They wake up and say, "Time to survive." And every few scenes, the show asks you, quietly, who you'd become in a place like that. Would you be noble? Or would you be strategic? Would you still recognize yourself if every conversation was a trap? There's a moment in the middle stretch of this drama's return arc where you can feel Lyra realizing that the palace is not a place where you get to be tired. The outside world can be hard, sure, but the palace has this special kind of cruelty. It demands performance even when you're breaking. And she's breaking because her child is sick, because she's sleeping in a place that once rejected her, because she's surrounded by whispers, because Kale keeps existing in her peripheral vision like an unresolved sentence. Yet she still has to speak carefully. She still has to choose her words like their currency. That's the kind of tension the show does well, constant emotional budgeting. And then you have Kale, who's used to being the one everyone else budgets around. He's the storm, not the person holding an umbrella. So watching him be destabilized by human woman's persistence is delicious. The show makes him look like a man who has conquered 1,000 external things and never learned how to conquer himself. And I don't mean in a Rava, alpha king way. I mean in a his self-control is actually self-denial way. That's why he was vulnerable to the prophecy lie in the first place. He's conditioned to treat doubt as treason. And look, I'm not going to pretend the fake prophecy element is subtle writing. It's not. It's operatic. But the drama gets away with it because prophecy here is less about magic and more about narrative control. Whoever controls the prophecy controls the story people tell about what's allowed to happen. Lyra and Kale's love wasn't just personally inconvenient, it was narratively inconvenient. It didn't fit the kingdom's preferred myth of the Dragon King as untouchable, pure, above human mess. A fake prophecy is basically propaganda wearing glitter, and the way the show frames Kale's reaction to realizing he was manipulated, again, staying moderate here, not giving away exact dominoes, what's compelling is that it isn't just rage at the liar. It's shame at himself. And shame is such a key ingredient in this drama. Kale is ashamed that he wanted Lyra. Ashamed that he threw her out. Ashamed that he was weak enough to be tricked. Ashamed that he might have a child he didn't protect. And shame makes him act in ways that are not always kind. The show understands that shame isn't humble. Shame is defensive. Lyra, meanwhile, is navigating a different kind of shame. Not shame at what she did, but shame imposed on her by the court's case. The way people look at her like she's a stain. The way her humanity is treated as lesser. And she has to resist internalizing that. It's so easy, in stories like this, to make the rejected woman come back as an ice queen who's over it. Lyra isn't over it. She's managing it. She's living with it. That's more honest. And if you're wondering whether the show ever lets them just talk like adults, the answer is sometimes, and when it does, it's electric, but it's also frustrating because they talk around the wound before they touch it. And the show is clearly saving certain emotional conversations for later, but it teases them in a way that feels like it understands how these people would actually behave. Trauma doesn't make you eloquent. Trauma makes you strategic. Trauma makes you avoid saying the sentence that would change everything. Now, one thing I don't want to undersell is how much the direction and editing contribute to the sense of suffocation. There's a rhythm to the way scenes cut in the palace. You'll get these long, slow, elegant takes when characters are performing, and then the moment something real breaks through, the editing tightens. The camera gets closer. The cuts get sharper. It mirrors the difference between public life and private panic. And the color palette does that too. The court scenes tend to feel colder, more metallic, more controlled. The warmer tones show up around Lyra and Amber, especially in quieter spaces, like the show is visually arguing that humanity brings color into a world that's been drained by power. And the sound design, again, deserves credit for making the palace feel like a living eavesdropper. Even in scenes where you don't see anyone listening, you hear the building. You hear the emptiness. You hear the distance. It creates this paranoia that fits the story's obsession with secrets and bloodlines. Speaking of bloodlines, the hidden blood ties surface element is where the drama starts playing with identity in a way I found genuinely compelling. In a court story, identity isn't internal. It's assigned. It's declared. It's used. When blood ties are hidden, it's not just a secret. It's a threat to the entire social order. And you can feel the story tightening around that concept like a rope being pulled from multiple ends. People's motivations become more legible. Certain protectiveness reads differently. Certain hostility has an origin you can sense, even if you don't know the full details yet. And this is where I want to offer another slightly contrarian take. I don't think the show's central fantasy is Kale will redeem himself, and there'll be a happy family. I think the central fantasy is the truth will finally be acknowledged. That's different. Redemption is about the wrongdoer feeling better. Acknowledgement is about the wronged person being seen. The show keeps returning to the idea that Lyra's pain was minimized, dismissed, categorized as disposable, and the real emotional payoff isn't just Kale being sorry. It's the world being forced to admit what it did to her. And the reason that matters is because second-chance romance stories often rush past the reparations part. They give you an apology scene, maybe a grand gesture, and then they move into, okay, love wins. Deny me, Dragon King feels more invested in the cost. It keeps asking, what does Kale have to give up to truly choose Lyra and Umber? If he doesn't give up anything, then the choice is cheap. Now, does the show always execute that perfectly? No. There are moments where it flirts with letting Kale's power solve things too easily. And I was like, hold on, if the king can just decree solutions, why did Lyra have to suffer for years? And the show sometimes answers that through politics, power isn't absolute, power is negotiated. But occasionally it still feels like the script wants the convenience of king fixes it without fully interrogating the implication. That's a tension the show needs to keep earning. But when it does interrogate it, when it shows Kale trying to wield power and realizing it has limits, those scenes are juicy. Because then you see him confronted with the fact that being king didn't make him wise. Being king just made him untouchable. And now he has something he can't command into safety. Trust. There's a scene vibe I want to linger in, because it's one of those moments that feels like the drama is daring you to believe in them again. Lyra and Kale are near each other, close enough that you can feel the history in the air. Umber is the unspoken center, the reason they're even in the same space. And Kale says something, nothing huge, just a line that suggests he's finally seeing the situation from Lyra's point of view for a second. Lyra doesn't melt. She doesn't reward him. She just looks at him with that expression that says, don't perform in sight. Live it. And it's so satisfying because the show understands that women don't owe men emotional applause for catching up. And Kale's reaction to that kind of boundary is what determines whether he's salvageable. The drama keeps testing him. Does he respond with entitlement, like, after all I'm doing? Or does he respond with humility, like, you're right, I have to earn it? And it's not consistent, which is realistic. People don't change in a straight line. But the inconsistency also makes you nervous. Because Lyra is risking something every time she lets him near. And Umber, in all of this, is the quiet emotional barometer. The show doesn't need to give her long speeches to make her presence felt. Sometimes it's just a look from Lyra to Umber, a checking glance, a hand smoothing hair, a pause before answering a question because Lyra is listening for Amber's breathing in the background. That kind of mother-child specificity is what makes the drama feel grounded. You can tell the writers have either lived this kind of fear or at least respected it enough to observe it closely. And because the show makes Umber feel real, every time the court treats her like a political object, it hits harder. There's a particular cruelty in adults using a child's existence as a battlefield. The drama understands that cruelty and doesn't romanticize it. It lets you feel the anger. It lets you feel the nausea of it. If you're still with me, this is where the drama starts getting addictive, because the romantic tension is no longer the only hook. The hook becomes, who is going to try to claim Amber? And for what purpose? Who is going to try to erase Lyra? And how? Who is going to manipulate Kale's guilt? And can he resist being stared by shame again? The story becomes less about will they reunite, and more about can they survive the consequences of reuniting. And I have to give props to the show's ability to make a search for a healer feel like a narrative engine rather than a fetch quest. It's not just traveling from point A to point B. It's an excuse to force alliances, to expose desperation, to create situations where characters have to ask for help from people they don't trust. And because this is a court drama, every request for a healer is also a request for information. Who knows what? Who can provide it? What do they want in exchange? It's that constant exchange economy, and the show makes it feel tense rather than procedural. One thing that surprised me is how the show uses romance tropes, but refuses to let them stay cute. A jealous rival doesn't just throw shade, they weaponize narrative. They plant ideas. They frame Lyra as opportunistic, as a seductress, as a threat to stability. And the show doesn't treat that as petty girl drama. It treats it as reputation warfare. Lyra isn't just fighting for love. She's fighting to not be rewritten. And as someone who watches a lot of these dramas, I always look for whether the show understands what it's doing or whether it's just borrowing aesthetics. Deny me, Dragon King understands the social mechanics. It knows that in a world obsessed with purity and lineage, a human woman with a half-dragon child is not just scandal. She's a crack in the myth. And myths are what keep monarchies alive. Now, I do think the drama sometimes indulges in the Kale is so tortured, lends a bit too much. There are shots that linger on him alone, brooding in candlelight. And I'm not saying I didn't enjoy it. I'm just saying, if you're going to give me 3 minutes of a man staring at a wall in guilt, I'm going to start narrating his inner monologue like, "Dear wall, I have done crimes." That's my limit. But even those indulgent moments serve a purpose. They show how isolated he is, how the king role has turned his emotions into something he can only process in solitude. And that isolation contrasts with Lyra's life, which has likely been defined by community in a different way. Not courtly community, but survival community. The kind where you rely on someone because you have to. The show hints at that difference in how Lyra moves through the world. She's used to making do, used to negotiating without authority, used to reading people quickly. Kale is used to people bending around him. And that mismatch is where a lot of their conflict comes from. The acting choices in these scenes matter so much. Kale's performance leans on restraint. You can feel him swallowing words. You can feel him choosing not to reach out. Lyra's performance leans on control too, but a different kind. Her control is self-protection. His control is dominance training. When they clash, it's not just romantic. It's cultural. It's two philosophies of survival colliding. And then Amber, because she is half-dragon, brings in that bodily reminder of difference. The show doesn't need to constantly show dragon features to make you feel it. It's enough that the world reacts to her as other. And that's where the themes get richer than you might expect from the premise. This becomes a story about mixed identity, about belonging, about what happens when your existence challenges a society's categories. Amber is a child, yes, but she's also a question mark the court can't stand. And the most gutting part is that Lyra is used to being other. Amber is new to it. Lyra can armor herself. Amber shouldn't have to. That's what makes Lyra's urgency feel so raw. There's also something about the show's title that keeps echoing as the story goes on. Deny me, Dragon King isn't just about Kale denying Lyra. It's about Kale denying himself. Denying his own capacity for tenderness. Denying the part of him that wants a family instead of a dynasty. And the show keeps asking whether he can stop denying long enough to actually live. And it does this through little patterns. Kale will offer something, then pull it back. He will approach, then retreat. He will speak, then correct himself. Lyra will soften, then stiffen. She will let him in, then shut the door. It's like watching two people touch a bruise and flinch again and again until one of them finally decides to stop running. Now, let's get into the jealousy element. Because jealousy here isn't just Roman spice. It's political emotion. When rivals are jealous, they're not just jealous of affection. They're jealous of access. They're jealous of influence. They're jealous of being the one who can shape Kale's decisions. And that's why the plotting feels more intense than standard love triangle drama. The stakes aren't who gets the guy. The stakes are who gets the kingdom's future. And because Kale is the Dragon King, his choice of partner isn't personal. It's symbolic. It signals what kind of rule he believes in. If he chooses Lyra, a human outsider, he's not just choosing love. He's choosing disruption. He's choosing to tell the court that the old rules can be bent. And people who benefit from the old rules do not like that. You can feel the show building tension around that idea without necessarily spelling it out in speeches. It's in the looks. It's in the way conversations go quiet when Lyra enters. It's in the way someone's politeness becomes a weapon. And again, that's where the drama is strongest. It trusts the audience to feel the subtext. At the same time, I'll admit there were scenes where I wanted a little more clarity on certain political mechanics. Like, okay, what exactly can Kale do unilaterally and what requires consensus or ritual? The show sometimes uses politics as a fog machine. It keeps things vague so it can heighten tension without locking itself into rules. That's a common fantasy drama move and it can work, but it also means you occasionally feel like the story is saying politics as a way to delay emotional resolution. And I'm like, yes, politics are real, but also, please stop using them like a curtain. Still, the emotional logic carries it. Even when the world building is slightly hazy, the character motivations are clear enough that you don't feel lost. You feel anxious, which is probably the intended effect. One of the strongest thematic threads is forgiveness, but not the Instagram version of forgiveness. Not forgive and glow. This is forgiveness as a negotiation with justice. Forgiveness as something you might want, but also something that feels like it would erase your own pain if you give it too easily. Lyra isn't just deciding whether she can forgive Kale. She's deciding whether forgiving him would betray the version of herself who survived without him. That's deep. That's the kind of emotional conflict that sits in your stomach. And Kale, on his side, is confronting the fact that he doesn't just need forgiveness from Lyra. He needs to forgive himself enough to change. Because if he stays trapped in self-loathing, he'll keep making defensive choices. Self-hatred doesn't make you better. It just makes you more likely to hurt someone again because you're afraid of facing the full truth. And you see that in how he reacts to challenges. When someone questions Lyra's presence, sometimes his instinct is to clamp down, to control, to assert. That's not protection. That's ownership. The show is constantly testing whether he can protect without possessing. And Lyra's reactions are what make those tests meaningful. She doesn't want to be possessed. She doesn't want to be a trophy or a secret or a scandal. She wants her child safe. She wants dignity. She wants honesty. And she's not dazzled by Kale's power because she's seen what that power does when it's turned against you. There's a quiet moment I keep returning to. One of those little human beats that fantasy dramas sometimes skip because they're too busy being grand. Lyra is alone for a second, and you can feel her exhaustion in the way she holds her shoulders. Not dramatic, just tired. And the camera doesn't rush. It lets you sit in the fatigue. It's such a simple choice, but it made me respect the show. Because it's acknowledging that heroism isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just continuing when you're empty. And then the show will yank you back into court tension with a scene that feels like a knife behind a smile, and you remember, oh right, we're in a palace. Nobody gets to be alone for long. If you're wondering whether Kale and Amber have scenes that feel meaningful rather than symbolic, the drama does give you that emotional potential. It plays with the idea that Kale doesn't know how to be a father because he's been trained to be a ruler. And those are not the same skill set. A ruler commands. A father listens. A ruler demands loyalty. A father earns trust. And watching Kale try to bridge that gap is one of the most compelling parts of the story because it forces him into humility in a way romance alone might not. And Lyra watching him attempt that, watching her decide whether to allow it, is equally tense. Because letting Kale in as a father means letting him into Amber's heart. And if Kale fails, the damage won't just be Lyra's. It'll be Amber's. That's the kind of risk that makes second chance romance feel like a horror movie sometimes. Like, yes, it's beautiful, but also, what if it goes wrong again? And that fear is what makes the show emotionally honest. It doesn't treat reconciliation as inevitable. It treats it as dangerous. Now, I want to pivot to something craft-related that I think a lot of people will feel, but not necessarily name, the show's use of near-miss editing. It loves cutting away right before a conversation becomes the conversation. Right before someone says the sentence that would change everything. And normally, that would annoy me. Normally, I'd call it cheap suspense. But here, it often works because it mirrors the character's avoidance. They keep almost saying it. They keep almost confessing. They keep almost apologizing. The editing is the emotional cowardice made visible. That said, there are times it overuses it. There were a couple moments where I was like, okay, if you cut away one more time right before honesty happens, I am going to start a support group for fictional characters who need to finish a sentence. But then the show will deliver a scene where someone actually does finish the sentence, and it hits like thunder because you've been starved. And that starvation is part of why the romance feels so intense. The show isn't handing you satisfaction. It's making you work for it emotionally the way the characters have to work for it relationally. It's a mean little structure, but it's effective. Let's talk about Lyra's agency again, because that's where my love for this drama really solidified. Lyra isn't passive. Even when she's in danger, even when she's outnumbered, she makes choices. Sometimes they're small choices, who she speaks to, what she reveals, what she hides. Sometimes they're larger choices about trust. And those choices feel informed by experience, not by plot convenience. She doesn't suddenly become reckless because the story needs drama. She becomes strategic because she knows the palace will punish her for being naive. And I appreciated that the show doesn't punish her for being cautious. It doesn't frame her boundaries as cold. It frames them as earned. That's a huge difference from a lot of romance writing, where the woman is expected to forgive quickly so the couple can get to the fun parts. This drama lets Lyra's caution be the fun part in a twisted way. Watching her hold the line is satisfying. And Kale, for all his authority, is often the one reacting. He's used to being the initiator. Now he's chasing something he can't order. That reversal is catnip for this genre, but it's also thematically appropriate. It forces him into the human position. It makes him feel what Lyra felt, wanting someone who might not want you back. And let me just say, there's a particular kind of joy in watching a powerful character be humbled in a way that doesn't feel like humiliation porn. It feels like growth pressure. Like the universe is finally making him develop muscles he never bothered to build. But of course, the universe in this show is not gentle. It throws rivals, secrets, sickness, bloodline politics, and legacy trauma into the blender and hits puree. And somewhere in there, you start realizing that the show is also talking about motherhood as a form of leadership. Lyra leads in a different way than Kale. She leads through care, through attention, through resilience. The court doesn't value that kind of leadership because it can't be measured in conquest. But it's the leadership that keeps a child alive. And the show subtly argues that maybe that matters more than a throne. And if you're still waiting for the steamiest emotional content, it's not always in the romantic scenes. It's in the mother-daughter moments. It's in Lyra's quiet panic. It's in the way she refuses to let Amber feel like a burden. It's in the way she carries fear without dropping it onto her child. That's love too. Maybe the purest love in the story. Now, I want to zoom out and talk about the show's tone. Because deny me, Dragon King is melodrama. Yes, but it's melodrama with a bruise-colored palette. It's not campy. It's not winking at you constantly. It takes its emotions seriously. And that can be a risk. Because when a show takes itself seriously, any writing stumble becomes more obvious. But I respect the commitment. It's not afraid of sincerity. It's not afraid of longing. It's not afraid of tears. And in 2026 television, where irony is basically a default defense mechanism, I found that sincerity refreshing. There are little bits of humor, but they're mostly unintentional or character-based, not punchline-based. Like the humor of watching Kale try to be gentle and failing because he's never practiced. Or the humor of court people trying to act normal around a child who complicates everything. It's not a comedy, but it has those human absurdities that slip in because life is weird even in a fantasy palace. And then, because the show is also about hidden ties and jealous plots, it has this undercurrent of paranoia. Every kindness is suspect. Every gift could be a trap. Every offer might come with an invisible string. That paranoia makes the rare moments of genuine care feel precious. When someone does something kind without asking for anything back, it stands out like a candle in a drafty hall. And that's where the show's emotional stakes depend. Lyra is not just fighting for Amber's health. She's fighting for Amber's right to be loved without being used. She's fighting for a version of family that isn't transactional. And Kale is being forced to decide whether he can build that version of family inside a world built on transaction. If you're wondering what the show is building toward thematically, it's building toward the collision between private truth and public myth. Kale has lived as a myth. Lyra threatens to make him a man. Amber is the living proof that the myth is incomplete. And the court will do anything to protect the myth, because myths keep people obedient. And the reason the romance matters is because romance is the most human thing Kale has done. It's the one act that wasn't purely political. It's the one choice that wasn't purely duty. And he punished Lyra for it because he couldn't reconcile it with the myth he's supposed to embody. That's tragedy. That's not just misunderstanding. That's identity conflict. And when Lyra returns, she's basically saying, you don't get to be a myth at my child's expense. And I don't know how you watch that and not get emotionally invested unless you are made of stone or you have never been wronged in your life. In which case, congratulations, please teach a class. The show also plays with the idea of prophecy as narrative violence. A prophecy is a story that claims inevitability. It takes away choice. It tells you what you are supposed to do. So when Kale follows the prophecy lie, he's surrendering his agency to an external story. And Lyra's whole arc is reclaiming agency from external stories. She refuses to be defined by prophecy, by court rumor, by Kale's fear. She defines herself through action. And that's why, even though this is a romance, it has a backbone. Lyra's arc isn't get the man. It's get the truth, get the healer, get my child safe. And if the man wants to be in that life, he has to become worthy of it. And Kale's arc, at least in the portion we're talking about, is learning that worthiness is not a title. It's behavior. So when the show introduces new pressures, new rival moves, new whispers, new hints of blood ties, you feel the stakes rising not because you're afraid of a twist, but because you're afraid of what pressure will do to these characters. Pressure reveals. Pressure breaks. Pressure forces choices. And that's what I want to unpack next, because the deeper the drama goes, the more it starts challenging the audience's desire for a neat romantic payoff. It starts implying that even if Kale and Lyra love each other, love might not be enough unless the structure around them changes, unless Kale is willing to burn parts of his world down. And that raises the most dangerous question of all. How much of himself is Kale willing to sacrifice to stop denying the life he helped create? And that's what the latter stretch of Deny Me, Dragon King keeps tightening around, like a knot you can't loosen with pretty words. How much of himself is Kale willing to sacrifice to stop denying the life he helped create? Because it's one thing to feel regret in private and glare out a window like you're auditioning for the role of man who has consequences. It's another thing to take that regret and let it rearrange your priorities in public, in front of the people who benefit from you staying exactly the same. The show understands that change, real change, isn't an internal montage. It's a series of choices that make you lose something. And with Kale, the thing he risks losing is not just approval. It's the illusion of control. The identity he's been performing since he was old enough to wear a crown. That's why every time he leans toward Lyra and Umber, it feels like he's stepping off a cliff, and everyone around him is waiting to see if he falls or if he sprouts wings. And I want to be clear, the dragon in this drama is not just a cool fantasy garnish. It's a personality. It's a philosophy. It's a metaphor for power that's both inherited and dangerous. Kale's dragonhood reads like a lifelong permission slip to be feared, to be obeyed, to be isolated, to treat tenderness like a liability. So when Lyra comes back, she's not just asking him to be kind. She's asking him to become a different kind of dragon. And that's basically asking a ruler to rewrite his own mythology in real time. If you're still wondering why this show becomes such a binge trap, it's because it keeps giving you these moments where you think, okay, now he gets it. And then it immediately tests that understanding under pressure. Not just romantic pressure, but political pressure, familial pressure, legacy pressure. It's like the drama is going, oh, you believe in growth? Cute. Let's see if it survives a room full of people who would rather die than let the king be human. One of the most effective things the show does in the back half is it makes the palace feel smaller. Early on it's vast, echoing, grand. Later, the same halls start to feel like they're closing in. The camera lingers on corners, on curtains that look too heavy, on doorways that feel like thresholds you might not get to cross back through. It's not a literal change in set design, obviously, but the way it's shot shifts your emotional sense of space. The palace stops being impressive and starts being claustrophobic. And that's exactly how it feels when secrets are tightening their grip. And speaking of secrets, the hidden blood ties thread starts doing that delicious thing where you can feel the story's gravity change. It's not just a twist engine. It becomes a lens. Suddenly conversations from earlier take on a different flavor. Certain protectiveness reads less like kindness and more like strategy. Certain resentment has an origin that isn't purely jealousy. And the show is smart enough not to treat blood as automatically meaningful in a sentimental way. It treats blood as a claim, a threat, a chain. When blood ties surface, it isn't all warm reunions and destiny. It's lawyers in the form of nobles, basically. And here's where I'm going to challenge what I think is the obvious audience instinct. A lot of viewers, understandably, want the story to become a clean vindication for Lyra. They want her to walk into the palace, drop the truth on the table, watch everyone gasp, and then get her crown and her happy ending while Kale kneels and cries and says sorry in fluent accountability. And listen, I also enjoy catharsis. I have a pulse. But I actually think the show is better when it refuses to make Lyra's pain into a spectacle for other people's enlightenment. Because the court is not going to learn. Not quickly. Not collectively. Systems don't apologize in unison. They adapt. They absorb. They rebrand. If Lyra gets validation, it won't come from the court suddenly developing a conscience. It will come from Lyra refusing to let their worldview define her. And that's why the show's quieter acts of reclamation hit harder than any everyone claps moment would. There's also something I didn't expect to feel. Sympathy for the concept of a prophecy, not as a plot device, but as a cultural virus. In Kale's world, prophecy is like law wearing spirituality. It gives people a way to justify cruelty while feeling righteous. And it doesn't just trick Kale. it shapes him. It shapes what he thinks leadership is supposed to look like. So when the show circles back to the fake prophecy and its fallout, what's compelling isn't the gotcha. It's watching Kale confront the possibility that his moral compass has been outsourced his entire life. That is a horrifying realization. And it's not the kind of realization you solve with one apology and a bouquet. If you're waiting for the drama to deliver the big emotional reckonings, it does move toward them. But it makes you sit in the discomfort first. It keeps putting Lyra and Kale in situations where they're forced to cooperate without intimacy, forced to share space without claiming it, forced to speak like allies while they still feel like enemies in their private memories. And those scenes, honestly, are some of the best acting showcases. Kale's performance in those moments leans heavily on the eyes. Not just the longing eyes, the shame eyes, the I want to fix this, but I don't know how without making it worse eyes. And Lyra's performance, when it's at its best, is like watching someone do emotional math in real time. She'll hear a line, you'll see the flicker of hope, and then you'll see her crush it down because hope has hurt her before. That layered response is what makes the romance feel earned. If Lyra forgives him too easily, the whole story collapses. The show seems to know that. And then there's Amber, who turns into the emotional lie detector for everyone around her. Not because she's magically sensing lies or anything like that, but because children force adults to reveal their priorities. When Amber is present, people's masks slip. You can't sustain petty performance when a child is sick in the room. Or at least you shouldn't be able to. And the people who can are instantly terrifying. I want to relive another moment with you, because there's a sequence in the later stretch that I experienced almost physically. I'm going to keep it general, not pinning it to a specific episode event, but you'll know the type of scene I mean if you watched. It's one of those late-night palace scenes where the lights are low, not romantic low, but exhausted low. Lyra is with Amber, and the quiet is the kind that makes you hear your own heartbeat. The room smells like herbs and warm cloth, like someone has been trying every remedy they can think of. And Kale enters, not with a grand announcement, but with that hesitant softness that powerful men only show when they're out of armor. He doesn't know where to stand. He looks too big for the space, like his presence could break something. And there's this moment where Amber's breathing becomes the loudest sound in the scene, and Kale's face tightens because he's realizing that all his power doesn't matter here. He can't command a body to heal. He can't threaten illness into leaving. He can only be there. And the way the camera holds on his hands, hovering, not touching, as if he's afraid of doing harm by existing too close, is quietly devastating. Lyra watches him, and she doesn't soften right away. She doesn't grant him the comfort of being forgiven just because he looks sad. But she also doesn't chase him out. And that tiny allowance, that tiny space she gives him to be present, feels huge because you know how expensive it is for her. It's like she's saying, you can witness this. You don't get to narrate it. You don't get to make it about your guilt. But you can witness it. And as a viewer, I was sitting there thinking, yes, exactly. Witnessing is the first step. Not redemption. Not possession. Witnessing. That's the kind of emotional specificity that separates this drama from the more disposable entries in the genre. It understands the difference between a man wanting to be needed and a man learning to be responsible. And I need to talk about responsibility because this show is basically a long argument about it. Kale's idea of responsibility at the start is protect the kingdom at all costs, which sounds noble until you realize it means protect the kingdom's image, protect the dynasty's purity, protect the structure that benefits me even if it destroys an individual life. Lyra's idea of responsibility is protect the child in front of me. It's grounded. It's immediate. It's not abstract. And the drama keeps putting those versions of responsibility in conflict until Kale has to decide whether the kingdom is a reason or an excuse. And just when you think he might choose right, the jealous rivals step in with the kind of plotting that makes you grit your teeth. Again, I'm not going to invent specific betrayals, But the show is very good at the emotional mechanics of manipulation. It understands that the most effective plots aren't the ones where someone twirls their cape and laughs. It's the ones where someone says the right thing in the wrong ear at the wrong time. Where they frame a situation so that Kale thinks he's making a wise decision when he's actually repeating his worst pattern. The show keeps testing whether he's learned anything, and sometimes it's almost painful watching him reach for old habits. But that pain is productive because it forces you to confront a question. How many times does someone get to repeat harm before you stop calling it a mistake and start calling it a choice? And that's where the show's moral tension really lies. It doesn't let you stay comfortable in your shipping feelings. It keeps reminding you that love doesn't erase consequences. Kale can love Lyra and still have wronged her. Lyra can love Kale and still not be safe with him. Amber can be the bond between them and still be harmed by their instability. The drama doesn't let romance float above reality. It drags romance through mud and asks if it can survive. There's a point in the later stretch where the show starts playing with the idea of what healing even means. On the surface, yes, Lyra returns seeking a healer to save a sick child. But the deeper you go, the more healer starts feeling like a symbol. Not in an abstract, pretentious way, in a very practical story way. Everyone is looking for someone to fix something. Fix Amber's body, fix Kale's guilt, fix Lyra's heartbreak, fix the kingdom's narrative. And the show quietly suggests that not everything can be fixed by an external expert. Some things require accountability. Some things require truth. Some things require a person to stop running. And that's where the drama gets under my skin as a viewer, because it refuses to let you believe in a clean cure. If Amber gets better, it won't automatically make the family whole. If Kale apologizes, it won't automatically erase years. If Lyra stays, it won't automatically make the palace safe. The show keeps those realities in play, and it makes the stakes feel heavier. I also have to give credit to the costume and production design, because it's not just pretty. It's character storytelling. Kale's world is structured, symmetrical, armored. Lyra's presence tends to bring in softer textures, more movement, more human-scale details. And when those aesthetics collide in a scene, you feel the tension visually. It's like the show is asking, can these worlds coexist without one consuming the other? And then Amber, in that visual language, is the most interesting object in the frame, because she's the literal blend. The show doesn't have to overemphasize her half-dragon nature to make it meaningful. It's enough that she looks like she doesn't fully belong to either category. That's a powerful visual metaphor for what the family is trying to build, a place where hybridity isn't punished. If you watched a lot of fantasy melodrama, you know the genre sometimes treats half identities like tragedies by default. Like being mixed is inherently cursed. Deny me, Dragon King flirts with that danger, because the sickness could be read as, see, the child is suffering because the union was wrong. But I don't think that's the show's core message. I think the sickness reads more like the consequence of rupture and secrecy rather than the consequence of mixing. The harm doesn't come from Lyra and Kale being different. The harm comes from the world refusing to make space for their difference. And that's a subtle but important distinction. It's the difference between a story that reinforces purity narratives and a story that challenges them. Now, I do want to talk about Lyra's emotional arc in the later stretch, because she's not static. She's not just strong mom who endures. She evolves. And what I appreciate is that her evolution isn't about becoming softer for Kale. It's about becoming more honest with herself. There's a shift where you can feel her admit, privately, that the spark is still there, that she still feels something. And that admission is terrifying to her because it threatens the stability she built after being cast out. Lyra's strength isn't that she doesn't feel. Her strength is that she feels and still chooses survival. And the show gives her moments where she lets herself mourn what she lost. Not just the relationship, but the alternate life she could have had. The life where Amber was welcomed. The life where she wasn't forced to become hard in certain ways. Those scenes are quiet, but they're brutal. And they made me respect the writing, because it's acknowledging that grief isn't just about what happened. It's about what didn't happen. And Kale, meanwhile, is confronting his own grief too. Not just grief for Lyra. Grief for the years he missed. Grief for the father he didn't get to be. Grief for the part of him that could have been better earlier. And again, I'm not letting him off the hook, but grief is part of how people change. It's hard to become a different person without mourning the person you were. One of my favorite craft choices in the later arc is how the show uses silence. Not empty silence, but loaded silence. There are scenes where Lyra and Kale are in the same space, and the dialogue is minimal, and yet you feel like the room is screaming, and the camera doesn't always cut to the obvious reaction shot. Sometimes it stays on the person not speaking. It lets you watch them listen. Listening is underrated on camera. It's where actors show you what a character is actually taking in. And this show gives its actors time to do that. And the score, when it's used in those scenes, is often restrained. It doesn't try to dictate emotion. It underlines it lightly. It trusts the performances. That's good taste. And in a drama, this melodramatic by premise, taste matters. Let's also acknowledge the elephant. A lot of viewers come into these stories with an appetite for punishment. They want Kale to suffer. They want him to grovel. They want him to be wrecked. And the show does give you some of that emotional suffering because Kale has consequences. But it doesn't turn it into sadism. It doesn't make suffering the point. The point is transformation. And here's my respectful hot take. If Kale grovels too perfectly, too early, the story actually becomes less interesting. Because then the tension collapses into wish fulfillment. The reason Deny Me, Dragon King stays gripping is that Kale's growth is incomplete and messy. He's learning, but he's still him. He still has instincts shaped by power. He still defaults to control under stress. Watching him wrestle with that is more compelling than watching him become instantly enlightened. Now, I'm going to be honest again in a way that might make me sound like a terrible person. There were moments where I sympathized with the idea of the court being afraid of Lyra and Umber. Not because Lyra and Umber are wrong to exist, obviously, but because from the court's perspective, destabilization is dangerous. In a kingdom, instability can mean war, famine, rebellion, death. Courts fear disruption because disruption has consequences for everyone, not just for the privileged. So when the court reacts with panic to a huff dragon child entering the succession conversation, part of me was like, yeah, that panic is realistic. But the show doesn't let that realism become justification for cruelty. It shows you the fear, and then it shows you what fear does when it becomes policy. It shows you how easily stability becomes an excuse to erase people. And that's where the drama is doing something smarter than its premise might suggest. It's interrogating the moral seduction of for the greater good. Because the greater good is often just the existing order. And Lyra, by refusing to disappear, forces the kingdom to confront whether its order is actually good or just familiar. And can we talk about how exhausting it is to be the person who forces the truth into a room? Lyra doesn't get to just be. She has to represent. She has to prove. She has to be careful. The drama captures that exhaustion. There are moments where you can see the weight of being the outsider who's constantly being interpreted. And it made me feel, weirdly, protective and angry in equal measure. Like, why does the burden always fall on the person who is wrong to also be graceful while the wrongdoer gets to be complicated? But that anger is part of why the show works. It makes you feel injustice. It doesn't just tell you it happened. And now I want to talk about romance again. Because even with all this politics and family trauma and illness stakes, the romantic engine is still humming. And the show knows exactly when to turn it up. It understands the power of near touch, of a shared look, of an interrupted sentence. It understands that in second-chance romance, the most erotic thing is often restraint. The decision not to cross a line, because crossing it would be dishonest or unsafe. That kind of restraint is charged. There's a scene type, Deny Me, Dragon King does repeatedly in the late stretch. Kale offers something that looks like security, and Lyra has to decide whether it's safety or a cage. And every time she hesitates, you can feel her weighing it. Is this protection? Or is this control dressed as protection? And Kale has to confront that too. He's so used to protection meaning control. He has to learn that the kind of protection Lyra needs is support, not ownership. And the drama makes that lesson hurt. Because the easiest way for Kale to solve threats is to dominate. But dominating would repeat the same dynamic that allowed him to cast her out in the first place. The show is basically saying, you can't heal a relationship with the same tools you used to break it. Now, I'm going to talk about one element that might be divisive. The show's willingness to keep Lyra and Kale in a cycle of progress and setback. Some viewers will find it frustrating, like the drama is dragging things out. And yes, there are moments where you can feel the writers squeezing the tension like a stress ball. But thematically, it makes sense. Trust doesn't rebuild in a straight line. If the show had Lyra forgive Kale fully the moment she returned, it would be emotionally dishonest. If the show had Kale become a perfect father overnight, it would be fantasy in the worst way. So while the cycle can sometimes feel like it's slowing the plot, it's also the plot. The plot is emotional repair under hostile conditions. Of course it's messy. Of course it loops. That's the point. And I know I'm being generous here, so let me also be critical. There are times when the show uses someone overhears something or timing is awful as a tension lever a bit too often. Like, the palace has impeccable acoustics when the writers need it and absolute soundproofing when they don't. And I'm sitting there like, okay, so the real magic in this show is selective hearing. But because the core emotions are strong, I forgave more of those conveniences than I normally would. What I didn't forgive as easily were a couple of moments where the rivals' plotting starts to feel like plot mechanics rather than character desire. Like, you can sense the hand of the writer arranging obstacles. That's when the drama briefly loses its human texture. But it usually snaps back quickly by grounding the conflict in Amber's reality or Lyra's boundaries. And that's where it regains its weight. And if you're curious whether the show ever lets Kale and Lyra have a conversation that isn't about crisis, it does, but it often turns those moments into emotional landmines. A calm conversation becomes a memory trigger. A soft look becomes a flash of pain. The show doesn't let them be naive about their history. Even their tenderness has a shadow. There's one latent mood shift I really appreciated. The story starts feeling less like, will they reunite, and more like, what kind of family are they building, and what will it cost to protect it? That's when Kale's choices become more interesting, because now he's not just trying to win Lyra back. He's trying to become someone who can exist in a family without dominating it. And Lyra's role becomes more than love interest. She becomes the moral center, not in a preachy way, but in a grounded way. She keeps asking the questions the court doesn't want asked. Who gets hurt by this decision? What does stability mean if a child is suffering? What does destiny mean if it's used to justify cruelty? Those questions don't just drive romance. They drive governance. The show is quietly political in that way. And I want to pause and give the drama credit for not turning Lyra into a magical savior who fixes the kingdom by existing. She doesn't civilize the court with her goodness. The court remains itself. And that's more realistic. She influences Kale. Yes, because intimacy changes people. But she doesn't single-handedly rewrite a system. She forces a person within the system to confront his complicity. That's a more believable kind of impact. Now, as we move toward the endgame energy, the show starts ramping the tension around those blood ties and rival agendas. And it does it with a combination of escalating stakes and tightening emotional focus. The plot threads begin to converge, and you can feel the drama preparing to demand final choices. And when it does that, it leans on a few recurring visual motifs. Firelight flickering on faces, shadows across palace walls, that sense of old stone absorbing secrets. There's a reason that aesthetic works here. This isn't a bright fairy tale. This is a story about what happens when love is treated as a threat. So the darkness in the visuals isn't just mood. It's thematic. It's the weight of unspoken truth. It's the long shadow of a decision made years ago that keeps haunting everyone in the present. And I want to talk about that years later gap again, because the show uses it as a wound, not a time skip. It's not just a convenience to make Amber old enough to have agency. It's a moral gap. It's time Kale doesn't get back. Time Lyra doesn't get back. Time Amber lived without her father's protection. And that's what makes Kale's late devotion complicated. Because devotion now is meaningful, but it can never be equivalent to being there then. The show doesn't let him buy back the past. It lets him grieve it. And that grief is what makes his better moments feel earned. When Kale does something right, you don't feel like the writers are bribing you. You feel like he's finally aligning his power with his responsibility. Now, I know some of you are probably thinking, okay, but do they actually still have that spark? Do they have the romantic juice beyond trauma? And yes, the show keeps proving they do. But it proves it in a way I found more mature than a lot of fantasy romances. It shows you that attraction doesn't disappear just because you are hurt. It also shows you that attraction is not enough to build safety. Lyra can feel pulled toward him and still say no. Kale can feel consumed by her and still have to respect her boundaries. That respect is what determines whether the romance becomes healthy. And watching Kale learn respect is, frankly, more satisfying than watching him learn how to seduce. He already knows how to seduce. Power seduces by existing. Respect has to be chosen. There's also a fascinating tension in the show's handling of masculinity. Kale's masculinity is the king kind. Stoic, controlling, commanding, emotionally withheld. Lyra keeps pushing him toward a different masculinity. Protective without ownership, strong enough to be vulnerable, brave enough to admit wrong. And the drama doesn't make that shift easy. It treats it like a cultural rebellion inside one man's body. And to be honest, there were moments where I felt almost sad for Kale in a way I didn't expect. Not because he's the victim, but because he's been shaped by a world that equates tenderness with weakness. When he tries to be gentle, it's awkward. He doesn't have the muscle memory. He's learning emotional language late. That doesn't excuse what he did to Lyra, but it does make his growth feel like growth rather than a switch flip. And Lyra's femininity is also interestingly handled. She's not masculinized to be respected. She's not reduced to softness either. She's allowed to be both. She can be nurturing and furious. She can be practical and romantic. She can be scared and still walk into a palace. That complexity is what makes her compelling. Now, let's talk about the show's emotional climaxes without spoiling specifics. The lateral confrontations have this very deliberate staging where characters are often positioned like they're on a chessboard. People stand at distances that signal power. The camera angle choices emphasize hierarchy. And then, when truth breaks through, the staging changes. People step forward. Lines are crossed. Space is reclaimed. That's good directing. It uses the language of bodies in space to tell you when the emotional rules have changed. And when the drama hits its most intense emotional moments, it often does it through restraint rather than screaming. They're screaming too. Don't worry, this is melodrama. We're not here to whisper the whole time. But the scenes that linger in my mind are the ones where someone says something quietly that destroys someone else. Or where someone doesn't say something and that absence becomes the knife. And I'm going to say something that might not be popular. I don't think, deny me, Dragon King is primarily a romance. I think it's a family drama wearing romance clothes. The romance is the hook, the chemical reaction. But the story's real obsession is what family means when love is tangled with power and betrayal. Because Amber changes the genre. Without Amber, this could be a straightforward second chance romance about betrayal and forgiveness. With Amber, every romantic decision becomes a parenting decision. And that raises the moral bar. It's not just about whether Lyra can trust Kale with her heart. It's whether she can trust him with Amber's sense of self. And that's why the show's quieter parenting beats matter so much. The way Lyra shields Amber from court cruelty without making Amber feel ashamed. The way she tries to give her a childhood even while fighting for her health. The way she makes hard decisions with a steady face. Those moments made me emotional in a way that surprised me. Because I'm not always a parenting storyline person. Sometimes those arcs can feel like emotional manipulation. Here, it felt like lived-in love. And I'll admit, this hit a personal nerve. I've had someone I love be sick in a way that turned time into a monster. Not the same stakes, obviously, but that feeling of waiting for answers, of measuring days by symptoms, of doing that weird mental bargaining where you're like, okay, if it gets better by tomorrow, I'll never complain again. Watching Lyra live inside, that kind of fear, made my chest feel tight in a way I wasn't expecting from a Dragon King romance. It made the show feel less like fantasy and more like a story about the parts of life you can't control. And that's what makes Kale's power feel so small sometimes, which is a brilliant narrative choice. In a story about a king, the temptation is to make his power the ultimate force. But sickness is a force that doesn't care about crowns. It's one of the few things that can humble a ruler without politics. And the show uses that humbling to force Kale into a different kind of relationship with the world. One where he can't just command outcomes. Now, in terms of pacing toward the end, the drama does that thing where the plot threads start converging, and you can feel the narrative tightening. It becomes less episodic and more like a continuous pressure wave. For some viewers, that might feel intense in a good way. For others, it might feel like the show is piling on. I was mostly on the intense in a good way side, because the emotional stakes were already high and escalation felt earned. But I will say, there are moments where it threatens to tip into exhaustion. Like, okay, can we have one scene where people drink tea without it turning into a war crime? But then again, maybe that's the point. Lyra doesn't get to drink tea peacefully. So why should we? One thing that helped balance that intensity for me was the show's attention to micro-reparations. It doesn't always give you grand gestures. Sometimes it gives you small acts of respect that matter more. Kale listening. Kale stepping back. Kale acknowledging Lyra's authority as a mother. Those small acts are how trust is rebuilt. And the show understands that. It doesn't treat trust like a switch that flips once there's a confession scene. And when Kale does attempt grand gestures, the show often frames them as complicated. Because grand gestures can be selfish. They can be about alleviating guilt rather than meeting the other person's needs. The drama keeps interrogating that. It asks whether Kale's actions are for Lyra and Amber or for his own redemption narrative. And that self-awareness is rare in this genre. I appreciated it. Now, let's talk about the jealous rivals again, because I know people love to hate them, but I want to give the show credit for something. It doesn't make jealousy purely feminine-coded. It treats jealousy as a political emotion that can infect anyone. Men, women, advisors, allies, whoever. Jealousy here isn't, I want him. It's, I want what you represent. And that's a smarter, sharper use of the trope. And the show's depiction of rivals also highlights something about Lyra's vulnerability. She's not just fighting individuals. She's fighting a network. Rivalry in a court isn't one-on-one. It's social. It's whispers traveling faster than truth. It's alliances shifting. It's the way people decide what they believe based on what benefits them. And watching Lyra navigate that network with limited power is part of what makes her so compelling. She can't just crush enemies. She has to survive them. Kale, meanwhile, is used to crushing, and part of his growth is learning that crushing isn't always the answer. You can't crush your way into a healthy family. You can't dominate your way into trust. The show keeps forcing him to confront the limits of force. And this is where the dragon symbolism becomes delicious. Dragons are often portrayed as creatures of dominance, hoarding, territoriality. Kale has dragon instincts, metaphorically and maybe literally in ways the show hints at through its fantasy texture. And those instincts are in direct conflict with what Lyra needs: partnership, collaboration, respect. So the drama is essentially asking, can a dragon learn not to hoard love like treasure? Can he learn to share power inside a relationship? And that's a genuinely compelling question, because it's not just fantasy. It's about any person who's been taught that control equals safety. Now, acting-wise, I want to highlight something subtle. Kale's character requires the actor to communicate vulnerability without making him look weak in a way that breaks the fantasy. It's a tricky balance, because the audience has to believe he can rule, but also believe he can love. And love makes you look foolish sometimes. The performance finds that foolishness in small ways. The hesitation before speaking, the stiffness when trying to be gentle, the way he watches Lyra like he's trying to memorize her because he's afraid he'll lose her again. Those choices humanize him without defanging him. Lyra's actor, on the other hand, has to carry a lot of interiority. Lyra doesn't get to monologue all the time. She often has to be strategic, careful, guarded. So the emotion has to live in her eyes, in her breathing, in those tiny shifts in posture when a memory hits. And she nails that. There are moments where she looks at Kale and you can see 3 timelines at once. The night that felt like fate, the day she was cast out, and the present where she's trying to save her child. That layered gaze is the whole show. And Amber, as a character, requires a performance that doesn't feel like cute kid acting. The show needs her to feel like a child under pressure, not a symbol. And when it works, it's because the drama gives Amber enough quiet humanity to exist beyond plot. That's not always easy in a story this packed with adult conflict. But when Amber's presence lands, it lands hard. Now, can we talk about how the show uses the concept of broken love as a structural principle? It doesn't just tell you they're broken. It shows you how broken love functions. Broken love means you misinterpret kindness as manipulation. It means you flinch at tenderness because tenderness used to be followed by abandonment. It means you want closeness but feel unsafe when you get it. The show builds entire scenes around those emotional reflexes. And that's why when you finally get moments of genuine connection, they feel earned. Not because the writers withheld them for cheap suspense, but because the characters had to grow into them. At the same time, the show is not afraid to let love stay broken in certain ways. It doesn't pretend that the past can be erased. It doesn't pretend that a child's existence will magically heal everything. In fact, it shows the opposite. A child intensifies everything. It raises the stakes and the fears. It makes people more desperate. It forces decisions. And that's why the show's tension works. It's not artificial. It's rooted in real human dilemmas. There's also an interesting undercurrent in the show about class and species boundaries. Lyra is human in a dragon court. That's not just aesthetic. It's power. The court's prejudice isn't always shouted. Sometimes it's polite. Sometimes it's framed as concern. Sometimes it's disguised as etiquette. Those are the most realistic forms of discrimination. And the show portrays them in a way that made my skin crawl, because it's the kind of cruelty that can be denied. The kind of cruelty where the person doing it can say, I was just being proper. Lyra has to endure that, and the show lets you feel how corrosive it is. Kale's job, if he's going to be worthy, isn't just to love Lyra privately. It's to confront that cruelty publicly. And that's where his sacrifice becomes real. Loving Lyra and Amber in secret is easy compared to challenging the system that would rather they didn't exist. And this is where the show becomes more than a romance for me. It becomes about accountability with power. Kale has power. He can change things. The question is whether he will, and what he'll lose if he does. That's compelling drama. Now, I'm going to be lightly funny for a second, because I need to breathe. At some point watching this, I realized the palace in Deny Me, Dragon King, has the emotional vibe of a high school cafeteria, just with better lighting and more lethal consequences. Like, everyone is watching everyone, everyone has a faction. Rumors travel at the speed of sound, and the seating chart determines your survival. The only difference is in high school, you might lose your social standing, and here you might lose your head. Same energy, different stakes. Anyway, back to the suffering. The latent reveals and confrontations, again without being too specific, have a certain truth finally cracks through energy that the show earns by spending so long in denial. When denial is the central theme, truth becomes a weapon. It's not just information, it's liberation and destruction at once. And the show portrays that duality well. When secrets come out, it doesn't feel like a relief for everyone. It feels like an earthquake. Some people gain footing. Some people lose it. And you can feel the palace shifting. And I appreciated that the show doesn't make truth automatically cleansing. Truth can be weaponized too. People can use truth to harm, to claim, to punish. So even when a hidden tie surfaces, the drama keeps asking, who benefits from this truth? Who is being protected? And who is being exposed? That moral complexity keeps it from becoming a simple revenge fantasy. And when the drama finally starts moving toward its emotional resolutions, it doesn't do it with just one big speech. It does it with a series of choices that accumulate. Kale choosing to listen. Lyra choosing to allow presence. Kale choosing to prioritize Amber over reputation. Lyra choosing to speak truth even when it risks her safety. Those choices are the real climaxes. The plot twists are exciting, sure, but the emotional climaxes are behavioral. Now, I will say, there are viewers who will not have patience for this show's intensity. It's heavy. It's earnest. It's not ironic. It's not trying to be cool. It's trying to be felt. And if you're not in the mood to feel, it will annoy you. It will feel like too much staring, too much anguish, too many near confessions. But if you are in the mood for a drama that takes emotional consequence seriously, this is the kind of show that will feed you. And because I'm me, I have to talk about whether the ending stretched levers emotionally. Without giving away specifics, I think the show's strongest ending choices are the ones that honor Lyra's boundaries. The show understands that a satisfying romantic payoff isn't Lyra surrendering her dignity for love. It's Lyra being met at her level. It's Kale coming to her as a man, not as a king expecting obedience. When the show leans into that, it feels cathartic. When it leans into spectacle for spectacle's sake, it wobbles a bit. But overall, the emotional through line is consistent. Denial must end, not just in words, but in actions. And Amber's role in the final emotional geometry matters. Again, no specifics, but the show doesn't forget that Amber is not just a symbol. She's a person whose future is being negotiated by adults. The best latent scenes are the ones that refuse to treat her like a bargaining chip. The ones where characters are forced to confront that a child is not a thrown accessory. When the drama centers that, it earns its tears. I also want to talk about the show's use of broken love as something that can be repaired but not erased. That's a mature approach. Some dramas treat repair as we're back to how it was before. But Lyra and Kale can't go back. Even if they reunite, it will be a new relationship built on a scar. And scars can be strong. They can also ache. The show doesn't pretend scars are pretty. It just lets them exist. Now, if you're asking me where Deny Me, Dragon King sits in the landscape of 2026 drama, I'd say it's one of those shows that's going to divide people based on what they think romance owes them. If you want a romance where the male lead is unambiguously admirable, you might struggle with Kale. If you want a romance where the female lead is constantly pining and forgiving, you might get frustrated with Lyra's boundaries. If you want a romance where the child is just a cute side element, you might find Amber's storyline heavy. But if you want a romance that treats love like something that has to be ethically rebuilt, you're going to eat this up. And my overall stance on it, after living with it for days and letting it marinate in my head, is that I loved it. Not because it's flawless. Because it's brave about consequence. It's not afraid to let characters be wrong. It's not afraid to let love be complicated. It's not afraid to let motherhood be the true center of the narrative. And it's not afraid to make the male lead earn his redemption in increments rather than in one grand gesture. My biggest critiques remain the occasional overuse of convenient misunderstandings and the way some rival plotting veers into mechanical territory. There are also pacing moments where the drama seems addicted to tension, like it's afraid of calm. I would have loved a few more scenes of genuine, quiet connection that weren't immediately threatened by a whisper campaign. Let the intimacy breathe sometimes. Let the characters exist without always being hunted by the plot. But the show's strengths outweigh those flaws for me. The performances carry layered emotion. The directing understands space and power. The sound design makes the palace feel like an antagonist. The music supports rather than manipulates. And the themes, denial, accountability, the cost of stability, the politics of blood, are woven into the romance rather than stapled on. Who would I recommend this to? If you love second-chance romances with teeth, if you like a morally complicated male lead who has to confront his own cowardice, if you are drawn to stories where a mother's love is treated as heroic rather than sentimental, you're going to be obsessed. If you like palace intrigue that feels like emotional warfare, you'll have a great time. And if you're someone who needs the female lead to be respected by the narrative, not constantly punished for having standards, Lyra is going to feel like a breath of air in a suffocating room. Who might not vibe with it? If you can't tolerate a male-led making catastrophic choices early on, even if the story hold him accountable later, Kale will test your patience. If you prefer lighter fantasy romance with more humor and less angst, this show is going to feel like it's squeezing your heart on purpose. And if you get triggered by storylines involving a sick child, I'd approach carefully, because the drama doesn't treat that element lightly. If you watched Deny Me, Dragon King, and felt like you needed to talk about it the way you need to talk about something that hurt you a little, you're not alone. That's what it did to me. It gave me that specific mix of rage, tenderness, and reluctant hope that only a well-made melodrama can deliver. I've been Flick Flair, and if you want more long-form drama reviews where we actually sit in the feelings and the craft instead of just rating hairstyles and shipping wars, you know where to find me. Leave me a comment with a moment that broke you the most, because I already know we're going to argue about Kale in a respectful, emotionally exhausted way, and I genuinely want to hear where you landed. And until next time, be kind to yourself, and don't let anyone else's prophecy decide your worth.